Hi, welcome back. Hope you had a great half term. So, let me talk about this next lesson. It's about radical reconstruction. And I just want to go through last lesson we were looking at Andrew Johnson. And I just want to sort of go through a few of the things there. So, if you just get your sheet out from last time. So, remember, what we're trying to think of was obviously Johnson became president after the assassination of Lincoln. And as I was saying in the previous lesson, basically, he was a war Democrat. He wasn't really part of the Republican Party and was incredibly unpopular with the Republicans. So, first of all, he was a slave owner himself. He believed, had racist views. He continued and continually vetoed laws passed by Congress to help blacks. So he used the presidential veto a lot. He pardoned former Confederate leaders, where many people felt they should have faced justice. He also left states in the South to decide who could vote in new governments, i.e. obviously Mississippi, Alabama and all those states, therefore would not allow blacks to vote. So he kind of turned a blind eye to all of that. He also refused to enforce laws in states who'd rejected the 13th Amendment. So, one of the roles of the president is to make sure that federal laws are being enforced. And also he didn't do anything about the black codes, these kind of segregation laws that Mississippi, etc., all these states were putting in place. And obviously he antagonised his own party. So there's a huge amount of evidence to suggest that he wasn't doing a very good job. However, you could argue on the opposite side that his main job was to get the United States back as a union. He was a successful governor of Tennessee. He wasn't a stupid guy. He was definitely anti-Confederate. And, he was also a realist and had joined with Lincoln through the war because he believed in the United States as a united country. So he wasn't a totally bad person, but it just sort of clarifies some of those things from the last lesson. So in short, by vetoing laws, by not enforcing the laws, by not challenging the black codes, many members of the Republican Party were disgusted by his behaviour and they impeached him. Now, he managed to survive that impeachment, which basically is they go to the Senate where evidence is presented like a trial and the 100 senators vote whether he should stay on as president or they get rid of him. And he survived by one vote. But what it did do was change the balance of power within DC, which we'll look at now. So we're on page 78, 79 of the book. So what I want you to do first of all, you also may want to watch that clip I've put on there. So in 1866, the radical Republicans, there was an election and they made big gains in Congress. And the two names you need to be aware of in the Senate, this guy called Charles Sumner, and in the House, Thaddeus Stevens were the main kind of leaders of the radical Republicans within that. There was two events that happened in May-June 1866 on page 78. Basically, there was some pretty horrendous racial attacks in Memphis and New Orleans. So watch the clip and also just add some things on the timeline there, which kind of stoked this kind of what on earth are we doing? We need to do a lot more to help African Americans. So what did they do? Because they had such a big majority in the houses, they passed 4 pretty radical acts. The most important one being the Military Reconstruction Act. And effectively what that was in short was the Union Army, the Northern Army, pretty much occupied southern states and enforced federal law. So they forced them to give black people the right to vote, for example, and they made sure that these states did what they were told. So that was fairly effective. They also passed something called the Habeas Corpus Act. Now, what that means is that this is particularly relevant for African Americans, and we'll look at some cases as we go through, is if an African American committed a crime in, say, Mississippi, basically the people who made up the jury were voters. So you guys can't be called up to be on a court jury because 1, you're not old enough, and 2, you can't vote. So if you're on the electoral register, you can become a member of the jury. So obviously the juries in the South were all white. So if a black person committed a crime, guilty. Or if you're a white person committed a crime against a black person, not guilty. So habeas corpus was important because it enabled black people to go to a federal court where it was much more likely they'd get a fairer hearing. So it doesn't really explain what that was in the book, but that's what that means. Excuse me. The third one's the command, however you say that word, command of the Army Act. And this again weakened the power of the president. Trump, if he wanted to, could just start a war against another country. But what they did with Johnson was they had all the orders going through the headquarters of the army, particularly through Grant, who was the general, later became President Grant. And this kind of, again, weakened Johnson. And also another thing that weakened him was the last one, the Tenure of Office Act, which ensured that Johnson couldn't sack or fire any members of the government he didn't like. In pure Trump-esque style, you're fired. So, it gave the Republicans more control over the president, probably the most that had ever happened. So have a look on page 79, explain what that's all about. Then in March 86, they also went even further and began to kind of weaken the power of the Supreme Court, which kind of prevented them from reviewing cases. So again, really, what this was, you could argue it was a power grab by Congress. They weakened the executive, they weakened the Supreme Court, but the benefit for the African Americans was huge. So basically, the Union Army was in the South and they enforced federal laws, they helped black people, all these kind of things. They protected and prosecuted the KKK, stopped them attacking black people. However, the long-term impact was much more complicated, but actually entirely predictable. If you lived in Texas, or if you lived in Louisiana, or if you lived in the South, basically, the idea of having an occupation army who was helping black people really set you mentally against them. So, for example, from this point onwards, the Democrat Party pretty much took the majority of the white votes, and they elected Democrat candidates for many, many, many years, 60, 70 years, because they felt kind of persecuted by this army of occupation and told what to do by DC. And inevitably it led to, more hatred of blacks because they felt they were, being bodyguarded by these kind of liberal, I don't know what they'd call them now, kind of liberal Americans from the Northeast who didn't understand or know anything about the South. So it's quite complicated. Watch the clip, page 78, 79. We'll do the Google Meet lesson on Friday, and I'll talk about 14th, 15th Amendment and the importance of those. Thank you.